Well, good morning, viewers. Today we have a Subaru Forester. I'm not sure the year. I think it's 11 or 12. And it's here because the dealership called the wheel bearings on this thing. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. So I've got the camera set up stationary here. I'm moving the top of the front wheel, or the back wheel. That's pretty bad. That's play in the wheel bearing. It's a sealed wheel bearing. The other side is not quite as bad, but it has play as well, and there should be zero movement there. So we're going to change both rear wheel bearings. So we got the wheels off the vehicle, and we're going to try to remove the brake caliper assembly with the bracket here. One bolt at the top, one bolt at the bottom. Hopefully there's enough movement on this brake hose to allow for that. We could undo it here and give us more movement. And then of course take the brake or once the caliper's out of the way, we can take the brake rotor off. So there's two 18 mil headed or 17 mil headed bolts that hold the bracket on. You can get at the bottom one with a combination wrench. Disconnect the electrical plug. There's a release tab under the rubber boot. And the caliper will come off and hang it by the spring with a suitable retainer. Now we'll take the brake rotor off. So you can put two 8 mil bolts in the brake rotor. And you can pop it off. There's no retaining screws or bolts holding the rotor on like on some applications. Now the wheel bearing is retained from the back. So there's 3 or 4 bolts that hold the wheel bearing in. And we're going to take the axle nut off. So this is the part number that I'm using, VR930768 SKF. Don't use cheap wheel bearings, in my opinion. Well, that was fun. I'll show you what happened on the other side. I used knocked the stud out, and I used a pusher to push the hub bearing out, but the bearing came apart, as you can see. So then I put 3 bolts in the back of the bearing and went through from the other side to push on it with an air chisel. And I had to work at it for quite a while. It corrodes really bad into the housing here. 32 millimeter nut and 14 millimeter bolts. In hindsight, you should probably pick up some new bolts because and longer bolts than this one. This size, but I think that's 12 mil, but it's fine thread focus. And I had difficulty finding them, some in my tickle trunk. But we're going to clean up the corrosion in here and reassemble this side. So there's the hub back on. I still have to torque this nut. It's 140 foot-pounds. The bolts that hold the hub bearing to the knuckle is 63 foot-pounds, and the brake caliper mounting bolts are 52 foot-pounds. But always double check my torque specs because I could be wrong. I'm going to put a screwdriver in here to stop the rotor from turning while I torque this. And we need to stake this axle nut afterwards. That's it. Put the wheel back on. Repeat the procedure on the other side. So always make sure that this axle shaft pushes in, because if you let that come out with the bearing, it might break the speed sensor. The speed sensor sticks down from the top of the knuckle. Don't try and remove it, or at least I wouldn't recommend it. 9 times out of 10, it'll just break, taking it out, and then you'll have to replace it. So just be careful. that you retain or push the axle in as you're tapping the bearing out. I'm going to show you what kind of troubles I had on the other side. Okay, so there are 4 retaining bolts that hold the bearing hub in from the back. You can get at them with a 12-inch extension and in a 14 mil socket. So that bearing is supposed to just push out of there now. If it's like the other side, I spent almost an hour getting it out. We're going to try pulling it out from the outside with my homemade adapter. I'll show you what I've done. So what I do is I take one of the axle studs out because it's garbage anyways. Might as well hang on to them. I have a pail full of wheel studs just in case. And then I put this bolt, a very long coarse thread body bolt from some vehicle that I salvaged, into the hub, and I use a wrench to pull it off. And it usually works, but it didn't work on the other side. It ended up pulling the bearing apart. Where's my 20? So I'm using this bolt like a pushing tool. Unfortunately, it pulled the bearing apart, just like the other side. But that's okay because I didn't have bolts to sacrifice to put into the back of this. Notice the grease is contaminated with rust. So I threaded in bolts in here so that I could push from the back with my air hammer. But we're gonna soak it down with penetrating fluid. Not that it's gonna help much, but every little bit helps, I think. So I threaded bolts in here because I don't have long bolts with this thread pitch. It's like 12 millimeter fine. So I'm going to get set up for this. Okay, so I've got 3 bolts threaded in from the front side, and now I'm pushing from the back side with an air hammer against those bolts. Yes, this is supposed to fall out. The vacuum plate's coming loose. And my bolt's stuck in there. We got another bolt here for pushing on. There it is here. Make sure the axle stays this way Well, it's coming. You got to keep revisiting these bolts because they'll thread out from the impact. I'll keep working it, but that's what we're doing. It's just 0.5. Yeah, it's coming now. Get my punch stuck in there though. There we go. That's what I had to do on the other side. And of course, the backing plate is stuck on there too. But that's minor. We got one bolt stuck in there still. Oh well, we'll get it out of the way. So you can see the inner bearing seal has been compromised and bearing has been contaminated. How rusty that is. And the hub is off. Now we clean up the spindle. Now we clean up this spindle area, the oxidation in here for where the bearing sits. See, I was using bolts that are drilled so that my center punch wouldn't bounce off the side. Anyways, that's rusted into this aluminum knuckle. And like I said, you have to be conscious of that wheel speed sensor in there, because if this axle comes out, it'll break that speed sensor off. So we're going to clean this aluminum flange up with a Rolox sanding disc. So use a die grinder to clean the corrosion out of here. Next, we put a liberal coating of anti-seize compound on the bore so that when we have to do this again, hopefully they'll come apart more easily. Put some never seize on these splines too, because they tend to rust in there, and I've had axle shafts that are seized in the bearing and you can't get them out. Anti-seize. All right, now we put the bearing in. So do these in a star pattern. The torque again is 63 or 62.7 technically. Double check them. That's good. Now we put the caliper bracket back on, or rotor back on, and then the caliper back on. So we got it back together. No play whatsoever now on the wheel bearings. So that's it. I'm sure this one will be fine now. Wheel nut torque on this was 90 foot-pounds, if I'm not mistaken.